I was thinking about school because the disciples, they seem to be in a class, they just don't get it, right? In fact, as I've gone through Mark, I've changed the disciples' names to dull disciples because Jesus continually asked them, are you so dull? Don't you understand? And I did that so much that now it just comes out naturally. I'm starting to talk about disciples and I just accidentally say dull disciples, and people look at me like I'm a strange guy. But I was thinking about the disciples, and they're in a class that it seems like they just don't quite understand. And I've been there, right? School, especially like elementary, middle school, high school, wasn't the easiest thing for me. My favorite class was probably PE, but that's just because it was the least amount of class altogether. And then if I made it to class in high school, then I would probably make it to an English class because the teacher had a little couch there that I could sit on. And I didn't have great reading comprehension either. So she would make me read passages over and over and over again before I ever began to even answer the questions that were associated with whatever text we were going through. I didn't do well in high school, right? In fact, that's why I didn't finish high school and I had to go back and do it all over again after I decided to go a different path. Another story, right? But then as I went to college, I found out there was stuff that I loved, like just subjects that I was really passionate about. In fact, I didn't think I was ever going to graduate because I kept changing, right? I really like geology. I really like sociology. I really like civics, right? I just kept going these different directions, mostly because I learned to love to learn, right? But I noticed that learning didn't come natural for me. I had to go back to that English teacher that said you have to read this passage over and over and over before you really begin to understand it. And that's how I approached most things now. I'll read something 2 or 3 times before I've really kind of let it all soak in. And it reminds me of the disciples because it seems like Jesus will reveal himself to them and they just won't understand. Like he's walking on the water and they just don't understand. Mark says because their heart is hard. Do you ever feel like that? Like Jesus has just revealed yourself and you just don't get it quite yet, right? I mean, that story comes after the story of Jesus calming the storm, like getting up and the wind and the waves are blowing over the side of the boat. And Jesus gets up and rebukes the wind and the waves and says, quiet, be still. The disciples are terrified and they say, who is this that can command the wind and the waves? Of course, we know the answer. It's God, Jesus, God incarnate. But even after all of this stuff, they still don't understand, right? They still have trouble getting it. Do you feel like the dull disciples sometimes? I've been at this ministry thing for quite a while. In fact, now I'm starting to come back on me. Robert is one of my kids from youth group. Now he's got 2 kids of his own, or 3 kids, or 4 kids. How many kids you got, Robert? 4. And then Ed and Cheryl, 16 years they've been married. That was one of the first marriages I've ever performed, ceremonies I've ever performed. Like it seems to be coming back to me. I've been at this ministry thing for a while, and I kind of feel like a dull disciple. I still struggle to get it sometimes. You guys in the boat with me? Yes, we're right there with me, right? And so when we get to Mark chapter 8, that question of do you not understand continues to pop up. Like how many times does Jesus have to reveal himself before you see him clearly? And one of the reasons this pops up is because in Mark chapter 8, we're going to have the second miraculous feeding, right? Jesus is going to feed a multitude, but it's a whole different multitude. If you read with me, Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 1, we're just going to read through verse 13. Here's what it says. During those days, another crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called the disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have had nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd, sit down on the ground where he had taken the 7 loaves and gave thanks. He broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples, and he went to the region of Dalmatha, right? If that's how you say it. Does this story sound familiar? right? I mean, it's just 2 chapters ago as we were going through Mark that all of these things, just almost a similar thing happened, right? I mean, Jesus is in a deserted place in Mark chapter 6. There's a great crowd around him in Mark chapter 6, and they are hungry. The disciples say, well, how are we going to feed these people? And Jesus says, you feed them, right? And so Jesus commands them to sit on the green grass, and he feeds the multitude. And after they're done, they had 12 baskets left over. See, there's so many similarities in this story that you have to wonder, why did Mark include it? In fact, some people actually think Mark actually messed up and included the same story twice. But do you think Mark messed up? No, I don't think so either, right? So I think Mark actually intended to put this in here. The question is, why? Why 2 feeding miracles? Maybe it's because he knows we're a bunch of disciples, right? Maybe he knows that it's going to take us a while to actually get it, right? You have to see things over and over again. And even after that, you're still going to struggle to understand, right? But more than that, this story is going to tell us that sometimes you can see a miracle and you can miss the message, right? That's my first point, by the way. Miracles can be seen, but the message can be missed. Right? Miracles can be seen, but the message can be missed. Now, this miracle, I think, has a little bit different message than the first time Jesus fed the multitude. In fact, the message is seen most clearly in verse 1. It says, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Did you guys get the message? No, that didn't make much sense, right? But you have to understand, what days is he talking about? Because he gives us a frame of reference. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Now, that brings us back to last week. Do you remember where Jesus was during those days? He went to Tyre, and then he went to Sidon, and then he was in the region of the Decapolis, which is 10 Gentile cities. And you guys should all be thinking, unclean. Thank you, John. Right? That's from last week. Right? Jesus is now among the Gentiles. And when he was in Tyre, and that's where he wasn't supposed to be because it was considered by Jews to be unclean, and he was in a house considered by Jews to be unclean, talking to a woman considered by Jews to be unclean, we should all be thinking like Jesus is overturning those traditions. And when the woman begs, just save my daughter, Jesus said a parable or a proverb that I think was common in the time. We talked about it. You don't take food from the children and give it to the dogs. And the woman said, but even the dogs get the crumbs from under the table. And Jesus was so satisfied by her answer, he healed her daughter without even being in the room. But now, check out the crumbs that are under the table. Jesus is in a Gentile place during that time. And they're receiving the same type of blessings that just happened in Mark chapter 6 in Galilee. See, if it's not right to take food from the table, then Jesus has more than enough for all, right? It's during that time in this Gentile area that Jesus has more than enough for all. See, that's really important because in verse 2, he says this, I have compassion on these people. How many Jews would think, why? Right? Maybe the disciples might think, why? I mean, these are the outsiders. These are the people that don't belong to the nation of Israel. If anything, they can be part if they get circumcised. That's what they might be thinking. But Jesus says, I have compassion on these people. Just like he had compassion on the people of Israel. Right? The disciples might be wondering why, but Jesus tells them why. They've already been with me for 3 days and have had nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. How cool is it that these people left when a long distance without considering what they might need for provisions, and they just sit at the feet of Jesus and listened? See, it's during those days when Jesus is in Gentile territory that the crumbs under the table is more than enough to satisfy these people too, because in Jesus, the dividing walls of hostility have been brought down. You see them in our society, right? Like different groups. Right now, it's become more and more popular to be part of different groups because we can be part of online communities and we can all just kind of stick to our own social bubble without ever stepping out of it. Are you there? Do you sit in your own social bubble? Jesus didn't want social bubbles. In fact, let's read from Ephesians chapter 2. I love this because this is what Jesus accomplished, right? In verse 11, he says, therefore remember that formerly you were Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done by the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenant of the promise. Do you remember that time? When you were not part of the covenant? When you were outside of the borders of Israel? And everybody said, no, God is just for these people over here. And then Jesus shows up during those days and has compassion for these people. And the crumbs under the table is enough to satisfy. Because at one time we were separate from Christ. We were without hope. Separate from Christ. Excluded from citizenship of Israel, right? This is verse 12. Remember that at this time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship of Israel, foreigners to the covenant, to the promise, without hope, without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. I'm just going to stop there. That's Jesus. He breaks down the walls of division that we see in our society all around us. The in-groups, the out-groups, the people we don't like to talk to, the people we don't like to talk to. Jesus has compassion on all those people, including me, because at one point I was without hope and without God. Were you there with me? Yeah. But during those days, Jesus stepped across the border to the region of Decapolis, and he performed the same miracle that he performed in Israel. And he showed that that dividing wall is coming crumbling down. Of course, it's not broken until Christ defeats death on the cross, but that dividing wall is coming crumbling down. And that's the miracle. Of course, there's more to the miracle, a lot of the same type of things that we saw in chapter 6. For instance, the disciples just don't get it. You see their question in verse 4? Jesus says, I have compassion on these people. I need to make sure they have food. And then in verse 4, the disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread for them? You guys want to say, duh? I mean, think about this. The disciples are saying, nobody can feed these people. Where can anyone get enough bread? And all Mark has to say is 2 chapters ago, Jesus did this for more people. Right? Like at this point, you would think the disciples might have gotten it. But see, sometimes you can see the miracle and miss the message. We do it all the time. Jesus works in our life, and we see it, and we overcome whatever issue, whatever problem we're going through. And the next thing we know, we're right back in the same problem, and we say, no one can help us get out of this problem. Maybe you just have to go back a couple chapters in your own life and recognize that Jesus has got you through this before. He'll get you through it again. Don't be dull. Right? Do you understand? Do you see the message? And so Jesus has asked the question, how many loaves do we have? I think he might have asked that with disappointment. Like, come on, guys, why don't you get it yet? But I might be reading my own opinion into the text. Maybe he's not disappointed with them. But he asked, how many loaves do we have? 7, they replied, and he told them to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the loaves, given thanks, he broke them and gave to his disciples to distribute. And he did so. There was a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute to them. People ate and were satisfied. And I just have to tell you, I talked about this whenever we were in chapter 6 with the first feeding miracle. But in the first century, being satisfied was not a common thing. Right? Like, it's just not as common as it is today. Who was satisfied with their lunch today? You guys got lunch. How lucky are you? Right? Like, go back to the first century. You didn't leave each meal satisfied then. We are living in a time of an amazing blessing. And so we are likely to read over that. They were satisfied. But see, I don't want to read over it because I think it's the point. Jesus is a compassionate shepherd who cares for his people. But here's the shocker. Not just the people of Israel. All people. And he satisfies all people. I'm part of that group, by the way, that is satisfied. Right? Because I understand man does not live off of bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of God. My second point is signs can be seen, but their meanings can be missed, right? We're going to skip down a little bit, and you're going to see in verse 11 that when Jesus gets in the boat, right? Another similarity. He feeds the crowd, and then he gets in the boat, and he goes to the other side. And then in verse 11 it says, the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus, to test him. They asked for a sign from heaven. Do you want to say like, duh? How many signs have we seen now as we've gone through Mark? Now they're asking for another sign. And so they ask for a sign for heaven, and Jesus sighs deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it, which is an interesting statement because Jesus has already given lots of signs, hasn't he? See, I think what's happening here is these people are looking for a sign to prove Jesus' authority to do what he's doing. In the last chapter, he's overturned the tradition of the elders. It's not about ceremonially washing anymore, right? It's not on the outside that makes you unclean, but the evil thoughts that rise up in your heart that make you unclean. He's overturned the tradition of the elders, and he's backed that up with his actions by going into Gentile territory and preaching the gospel and now feeding them as well. And the Pharisees come around and they see this Messiah, this one that's claiming to be the Messiah, and yet instead of rising up against the surrounding nations, he's blessing them. Give us a sign, that's what they say. Give us a sign to prove that you can do what you say you can do. They want a specific kind of sign, a sign from heaven. You know, I think I remember reading about one of those. In Mark chapter 1, what do you think happened? There was a sign from heaven. Mark chapter 1, verse 9, it says, at that time Jesus came to Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming out of the water, he saw heaven being torn apart. Do you imagine that? Heaven not just opening, but being torn apart, like you tear cloth. And the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, you are my Son, whom I love. With you I'm well pleased. Is that a sign? Maybe they won't accept that sign because it challenges their authority. It challenges their preconceived ideas. I remember another sign. It's in Mark chapter 2, the paralytic, right? All the paralytic's friends came and they brought him and they took him to Jesus, and they lowered him from the roof, and Jesus saw him and he saw their faith. That's what the text says. He saw their faith. And he said the most surprising thing. He said, son, your sins are forgiven. And all the Pharisees sat around and thought, in their hearts, they thought, who is this that can forgive sins? Only God can forgive sins, right? I think they were, not only were they thinking that in their heart, but their nose was probably sticking up when they said it, right? And Jesus heard what they said in their hearts. And he said, so that you know that the Son of Man has authority to forgive sins, I tell you, take up your mat and walk. Is that a sign? See, Jesus has given them signs. Now you understand why he sighs. Because how many times does it take? The disciples are there with him. He's shown them over and over again. They still don't get it. And the religious leaders refuse to get it because they want a sign from heaven. And the reason they want a sign is because trusting in Jesus means for them, they have to let go of some of their power. They don't want to do that. They have control of the people. It also means for them they have to let go of some of their preconceived ideas. I mean, they believe the Messiah was one who's going to redeem Israel, destroy the nations around him, and redeem Israel. And now Jesus is over there messing around with the people on the other sides of the border? No, they want a sign, and Jesus sighs. He says, this generation is always wanting a sign, always wanting a sign. Paul says something about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He says this, verse 22. It says, Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block for the Jew, and a stumbling block to the Jew, and foolishness to the Greeks. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. He is both the sign and the wisdom of God. Isn't that amazing? To those who believe it. See, but there will always be those who see the sign and refuse to accept them. We have them in our world as well, don't we? I mean, how many times does Jesus have to reveal himself before the Pharisees and the religious leaders accept him? And even in our world, we wonder, how many times do you have to see the power of God in action before you'll ever accept it? this past week, we've been, by the way, if you know anybody who has kids, make sure they come to Vacation Bible School on the 17th through the 21st of this month. But this past week, I started promoting that event on Facebook. And it's the first time, like we haven't done this for a while, but I've actually started to pay for promotion, which means that the promotion itself goes out beyond just the people in the church, right? You know how many comments I've gotten? Negative comments. Like, oh, look, this church is grooming people, right? I had one guy write, you know what? If you can pray for my friend who can't walk and he gets up and starts walking, then I'll attend your Vacation Bible School. And I just kind of laughed because I was preaching on this text this week. There are always going to be people that demand God do things their way. But you know, that's not faith. Faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you don't see. If God revealed himself and made it absolutely clear to you by giving the sign that the Pharisees demanded, where would be the need for faith at all? No, any belief in God requires faith. And whether you believe in him or don't believe in him, it requires faith. But that demand, I think that demand. So you can have a sign, but you can miss the meaning of the sign. The Pharisees have missed the meaning of all the signs that we've read about so far. My last point is that understanding Jesus requires faith in his past works. Understanding Jesus requires faith in his past works. And, Jesus gets in the boat. Verse 14 says this, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. See, those dull disciples, they just forget the bread. They have one loaf. Now let me ask you, is one loaf enough for Jesus? Yes, of course, because what did he just do with all the loaves? He multiplied them. And so anyway, Jesus gets on the boat. Maybe they're arguing over there in the corner and Jesus hears them arguing about bread. So he says this, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Right? Yeast. In Scripture, yeast has to do with sin. Right? It's that thing that is just, well, it's basically just hot air. You guys ever put yeast into bread? What does it do? It makes it rise. It gives the impression that that bread is a really big loaf, but inside is just air, right? And that's why sin and yeast are kind of put together, right? Other than the fact in the Old Testament, they had to leave without allowing time for the bread to rise, and so they took unleavened bread. But yeast, all it does is blow up the bread with hot air, and that's what Jesus is talking about. These Pharisees, they're just blown up bags of hot air, right? In fact, Luke talks about that. Same thing. But he tells us what the yeast of the Pharisees is. In Luke chapter 12, verse 1, it says, meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Hypocrisy is the Greek word for actor. It just means somebody who puts on a show. These Pharisees are really good at putting on a show. They have all the right dress, all the right lines. They say the right things, but they're really just hot air. They're really just putting on a show. And Jesus says, be careful of the yeast of the Pharisees because, well, it's infectious. Right? It's really easy for us to take on that same attitude. Yeast of the Pharisees. In Mark chapter 8, the yeast of the Pharisees has to do with doubt. They want a sign, right? Give us a sign to prove you who you are. That's the yeast of the Pharisees. But then when the disciples hear this is what they say. It's because we have no bread. That's what they think Jesus is talking about. They're being physical and Jesus is giving a metaphor saying, don't be like the yeast of the Pharisees. And they still don't get it. They don't understand. Jesus asks them just a ton of questions. Listen to all these questions. Why are you talking about having no bread? Don't you get it? Do you still not understand? Are your hearts hardened? See, we should be thinking the same thing, not just about the disciples, but about us, because as we've come to this point in Mark, we have seen all the things that Jesus has done and said, and all of those signs, all of those miracles were not just because he's a nice guy, but because he's saying something true about himself. When he heals when he forgives the man's sins and tells him to take up his mat, it's because he wants to show them that the Son of Man has authority to heal and forgive sins. When he feeds the multitude the first time, it shows us that he is a good shepherd who cares for his flock. Everything about that first miracle, that first feeding, it says Jesus sees them like sheep without a shepherd. He makes them lie on the green grass. Every time Jesus performs a miracle, it testifies to who he is. And the question is, don't you understand yet? Don't you get it? Is your heart still hard? Verse 18, do you have eyes but fail to see? Do you have ears but fail to hear? Listen to this one. And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? I think maybe I'm in the boat with the disciples. I've seen Jesus move in my life so much, and I still struggle to understand at times. That's me. But I'm not in bad company, because the disciples that are in the boat are the people that Jesus chooses to start the church. He gives Peter the keys to the kingdom. Peter preaches that first gospel message. Now, I know that they could have accomplished nothing without the Holy Spirit, but I feel like I'm in good company with people who have to hear the message over and over and see it over and over before I finally get it. Because I've been at this for a while. And I still sometimes say, God, I don't get it. And I still feel the frustration in God's voice when he says, don't you understand? Don't you get it? See, I think understanding Jesus takes time, and I think it takes remembering how he works in the past. Because if you can remember how he works in the past, it gives you a clue to what he's going to do in the present. And Jesus has done some amazing things in the past, right? He is one that satisfies. That's the kind of life I want to live, and I know that he can satisfy. I just know that if I have to understand him, it takes remembering and study and going back to that same story over and over and over. That's why I'm glad you guys are here. Each week we have a constant reminder. In the elements themselves, in the bread, which represents his body, and the juice, which represents the blood of the new covenant, we are reminded that we are not individuals, but we're part of one loaf, one body. And when you have one loaf in the boat, is that enough? Absolutely. Jesus is more than enough.